In an earlier lesson, we dealt with salad greens, and I think of salad greens, lettuces, and some of the specialty greens as greens that are tender enough to be eaten as they are. They don't need to be cooked. And today, we're going to take a look in this lesson at field greens, or cooking greens. Now, right here in the middle, I've got some spinach, and likely you've had a spinach salad that uses raw spinach, but you've also had dishes where spinach is cooked. So I think of spinach walking that line between salad greens and field greens. The rest of these are far too coarse to be eaten raw. So let me walk you through some of what we've got here. There's rainbow chard up here, and you can see the yellow color and the red color and the green color. This is a pretty tender green, but it does need to be cooked. Right next door, curly kale. And interestingly enough, kale has sort of made an appearance on the scene in salads where it's not cooked, but they do take it and they salt it, and typically they rub it and bruise it until it begins to fall apart. So it's not eaten raw as much as it is manipulated a little bit. It's becoming as popular as it is because all of these greens are a nutritional powerhouse. There's tremendous nutrition to be gained from greens like this. Every one of them is nutrient dense. Here, I have a green. It's got this heavily cut leaf. This is actually dandelion greens, and I know these to be really, really bitter. About the only time you can eat them raw is when they're very, very small, before the bitterness has started to take hold. These need to be cooked. That tames the bitterness a little bit, but after that, salt and acid and things like assertive cheeses will go a long way towards calming that bitterness down so that this becomes a pleasant eating experience. Back here I've got some mustard. This mustard grows wild in the vineyard. They use it as a cover crop during the winter. And one time I was hosting a Greek chef here who went down to the herb garden, and after 45 minutes he hadn't returned. And when I went looking for him, I found him across the street in the middle of the vineyards, and I said, "Chris, what are you doing over there?" And he said, "I want to use these greens." I said, "I bought you mustard greens." "No," he said, "I want these greens." So we went over and harvested the cover crop and brought it over. Last in this basket, I've got some collard greens, and these are pretty leathery. You know, you feel them, and you can imagine that eating these would be almost like eating the leaves that you rake up in the fall. But if you go to the south, what you'll discover is that they deal with these in a very particular way. They cut them up and they braise them in a smoky stock that has ham in it, and they lend their bitterness to that smoky stock, and the liquor that's left over, what they call pot liquor, is absolutely delicious. I'll show you that in just a second, but let me move these out of the way right now. And I want to share with you a little bit about what's on this tray. These are field greens as well. They're either too tough or maybe a little bit too spiky to be enjoyed without cooking. This one on the left is borage. And the flowers, if you pluck them off, taste almost like cucumber. There's little spines all over the leaves, so that if you want to use them, they need to be blanched first. The great thing about borage is it's one of the few vegetable sources of omega-3 oils. So the same oil that is so good for your heart that you get from wild salmon, you can find in a couple of different plants, and borage is one of them. The other, right next door, also growing in our garden as a weed, is purslane. And this is a vegetable source of omega-3 oils as well. When you taste this, it tastes a little bit lemony, and it eats almost like a succulent, almost like a cactus, so it's very, very juicy. We're going to actually feature this in another lesson. So I'm going to set those aside. The first dish that I'd like to make for you is something called Horta. It's a Greek dish, and it features greens. They are huge proponents of eating greens in Greece. I went to a market in Greece, in Athens, and I saw the crown of a zucchini plant with 1 leaf, 2 leaf, the stalk, a couple of blossoms, a couple of zucchinis. And they would take all of that and chop it up, boil it in water, and dress it with olive oil and lemon, and enjoy it because it was an expression of greens. What we're going to use today is this mixture right here. This is made up of a couple of different greens. You can go to the supermarket and find this. Basically, it's baby versions of almost everything you saw in that basket plus more. So I'm seeing purple kale here, and I'm seeing red chard, and I'm seeing a bitter green called frisee. Here is escarole, which is a bitter green as well. Dandelion greens, so on and so forth. A little bit of mustard in here. They're all delicious, and by buying braising mix, you don't have to buy a bunch of this and a bunch of that. You can still get variety. So what we're going to do is blanch these greens until they're tender. I've got boiling salted water right here, and we'll put them in. It's pretty alarming to see how they wilt down. So this huge bowl will be probably 4 portions or so. And what I want to do is press them into the boiling water, and then we're going to let them cook until they're tender. The braising mix typically is baby greens, so usually 4 or 5 minutes is enough cooking. It'll give us just enough time for me to show you this, which is collard greens that have been braised with a little bit of ham hock in the bottom. And I'm going to gather them up. Don't expect them to be bright green any longer. They've cooked for a long time. I'm going to add the ham as well. Sometimes I will take potatoes and I'll add them in the last half hour of cooking, and I will serve this with cooked potatoes as well. But maybe the best part of collard greens is this liquid that's left in the bottom. And if I give it a taste here, it's salty, it's smoky, it's rich, there's a little bit of fat that came from the ham hock, and I'm going to add some acid to it in the form of vinegar. And we'll stir it around, and then I'm going to spoon that right over these greens. You know, with some biscuits and braised collard greens, with that pot liquor, that's a pretty great meal. Let me just set that over here. When you're cooking green vegetables, what you should know is that acidity and long cooking is kind of the enemy. There is acidity inherent in all of these vegetables that is locked up in the cell structure. And when you begin to cook it and those cells rupture, the acidity is released, and that acidity will negatively impact the bright green chlorophyll and turn it kind of an olive drab. So what's a chef to do? Well, if you have a big pot of water that you're cooking in, what happens is you begin cooking it quickly. It doesn't stop boiling, and it cooks as fast as possible. The acidity is watered down by all of this water so that it's not as much of a problem. And when these are cooked, we'll take them out and we'll shock them in ice water to stop the cooking. And that's the way to preserve the integrity of this green color. This is a great model, what I call big pot blanching, where you put them in there and you cook them to the desired degree of doneness. This dish right here is sort of the antithesis of that. Here is a dish where I cooked it long and slow so that it could get tender. In effect, these collard greens gave up their integrity for the greater good of the whole dish. So they lost their bright green color, but now they're tender, and it's a delicious dish that's more than the sum of the parts. All right. I'm going to look in here at the toughest of these greens, and I think it's this purple kale. I'm going to pull the purple kale out and have you notice that it's no longer purple. Most purple vegetables, when you cook them, will turn green. But what I'm interested in is seeing how tender this is. And I think we're there. So I'm going to gather these greens up and put them right into ice water so that the cooking stops and I can set that green color. And I want to make sure that these cool quickly. That's what the ice water is all about. And the colander just makes sure that I don't have to pick ice cubes out of the greens when I'm all done. So the ice is on one side and the greens on the other. I'm just going to open them up, make sure that the cold water can surround them, cool them down, and that's that. I'm going to drain off the water. And then I'm going to take and squeeze them dry. So I don't want a watery finished dish. This is basically a cooked salad. I don't want a watery salad. So I'm going to squeeze the excess moisture out. Because I haven't cut the greens up, most of the nutrition will stay inside, will stay intact. So you remember the bowl we started with, and here's what we have left after having blanched it. What I'm going to do is take these greens and I'm going to cut them so that they're in bite-sized pieces. There's a nice variety of colors and textures here. And this is going to make its way into a salad bowl. And as the flavor of greens becomes more assertive, you need to pay attention that your dressing becomes more assertive as well. I had a student once who had a couple of hours just to cook some dandelion greens, and she came to me in tears because they tasted so bitter. And we went back to the stove and we added more lemon juice and more pepper flakes and a little bit of assertive flavors. And that tamed the bitterness to the point where she was so proud she went around, taste this, I just made it, it's perfect, it's really good, dandelion greens. A little bitter, but I think you're going to like them. So I learned the lesson all over again with her. Make sure that your dressing is appropriate for what you're adding it to. And assertive greens like this need a lot of punch. So here's a very vegetal olive oil. We'll add some olive oil there. I'm going to add lemon juice. We'll taste that in a second, but first I'm going to put some garlic in there as well. Raw garlic, which I think will tame these greens. I'll start with half, and I'll season this with salt, and we'll toss it together. Now that it's no longer in a tight little piece having been squeezed dry, I want to make sure that all the greens are coated with the dressing. And we'll taste and see. Just a little bit more lemon. The garlic I think is fine, so I'm going to get rid of the rest of this garlic. We don't need that. I'm going to add some feta cheese for a nice salty, creamy, savory addition to the Horta. And then finally, The flavors in here right now are very, very big, and they're kind of deep. There's bitterness, and there's earthiness, and there's the acidity of the lemon and the punchy olive oil. I want to try and bring a little bit of refinement, so I'm going to grab some dill. This could also be mint, something that's really aromatic that introduces a high note. I think mint and dill both would be entirely appropriate. And this salad is just about done. There is some bitterness in there, but it's pleasant. It's a pleasant bitterness that you don't get when bitterness is the star of the dish. Each of these greens tastes just a little bit different. I love the bright aromatic quality that the dill adds. And then every once in a while, just a little bit of the salty cheese. Just to make it taste nice and fresh. A little olive oil, a little lemon, a little bit of fresh cracked black pepper, and that is Horta, made with braising mix that you can find in your supermarket. It's at its best in the winter and into the early spring. So if you go to the market and pick up a new green and you bring it home to cook it, one of the first things I would encourage is just take a little bit and taste it. These are mustard greens here, and one of the great things about it is the peppery bite that you recognize as mustard. I'm going to make this into a salad. That peppery bite is assertive. There's some bitterness there, and these aren't really that tough, but they do need to be cooked a little bit. If there is a tough part on it, it's this stalk right here. So I'm going to make a point of removing that. I've done it with most of these, but just cut down the stalk and take that out. Here's another. So these greens have all been destalked. The tough part has been removed. And what I want to do is make sure that they're not too large. And so I'm going to gather them up and cut them into what I can imagine is a bite-sized piece. I'm cutting it into ribbons this way, about 1 inch. And having cut one way, I'll come back and get everything under control. All right. Now, I want to take and I want to cook this. I don't want to boil it. I don't want to drive off that mustardy goodness, but I do find them a little bit too tough. And so I've got a hot pan on the heat here, and I'm going to add some olive oil. And I'm going to add some pepper flakes. I'm going to add salt. And then, in effect, I'm creating a vinaigrette here. And in goes the greens. Now, I'm going to toss these in the hot oil and the vinegar until they just begin to wilt a little bit. And as they come down, you can see that they're beginning to wilt already. I'm going to turn off the heat. There's probably enough heat in the pan to carry them the rest of the way. And I'm going to taste them. And see how tender they've become and see how they taste. So a little bit more salt, a little bit more vinegar, and a little bit more of a really peppery olive oil. Pepper flakes, no problems there. There's plenty of heat. Now the bitterness is coming into focus. I think just a little splash of vinegar and I'm good to go. I've got some prosciutto here and it's sliced very, very thin. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of this dressed mustard greens and I'm going to put it right on the prosciutto. And then we're going to roll it up and transfer it to a plate. Let me grab another slice. This one a little bit larger. And we'll take some of the dressed mustard greens and roll this up. And those warm greens sort of bring out the flavor of the prosciutto. As a garnish for this salad, I've got some parsley here. And I'm going to squeeze over a good deal of lemon juice. A big pinch of Parmesan cheese. Salt, pepper, and olive oil. A parsley salad. This should have a lot of flavor. Don't be shy with the lemon juice or the Parmesan. I'm going to put this parsley right down the top. Sprinkle on a little more Parmesan. And this dish is ready to go to the table. So, wilted mustard greens wrapped in prosciutto with a pulled parsley salad. So, what I thought I'd do today is make some gnocchi with spinach. So we'll take a field green and we'll add them to a ricotta gnocchi. And once you know how to make this ricotta gnocchi, what you'll discover is that you can use the same recipe across the year and just add different vegetable garnitures as the season makes them available. Let's get started. I'm going to take and put some onion into this pan right here. I want to dice it up really fine. And I'm going to cook it with a little bit of pancetta. So let me just cut a small piece. I'll put the rest away. All right, so in the pan, olive oil. In the olive oil, pancetta. And we'll just let that brown a little bit. Cut up fairly small. I want to get the oil out of the pancetta or the fat out of the pancetta so that it can flavor some spinach. And now that it's underway, we'll put the onions in as well. With everything cut up this small, it should come together fairly quickly. When the onions are translucent, I'm going to add some spinach. And this spinach here, I blanched in boiling salted water. And as soon as it changed color and wilted, I took it out, I shocked it in ice water, and then I squeezed it dry. So the only thing I want to do now is just make sure that it's all cut up very, very fine. In goes the spinach. I'm going to season it with salt and pepper. And before we make the gnocchi, this mixture needs to have a chance to cool down. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to take it off the heat. I'm going to move it over. We'll let it cool down. But I have some here that was sautéed a little bit earlier with the onions and the pancetta. And I've added the spinach, and it's had a chance to cool. So there it is. Now, let's get started with the gnocchi. The gnocchi is going to start with a little bit of ricotta cheese. So we'll add the ricotta cheese, and to that I'm going to add this spinach. Right from the get-go, I want to mix all of this into this particular pasta. We need something to bind this together, and I'm going to be using egg yolks. But before we do, I'm going to season it with a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, and then some nutmeg. Just a pinch of nutmeg. So in goes 3 egg yolks. It's going to loosen things up a little bit. Now we're going to add some Parmesan cheese. I'm going to save just a little bit of this for a garnish later on. And we're going to add some flour. I want to add enough flour so that it comes together and I can manipulate it, but not so much flour that it becomes leaden and heavy. So here we go. Let me introduce a little bit of flour. And toss it gently together at this point. Why? Because I don't want to manipulate that flour so much that it becomes tough. Just a little bit more. Turn it over on itself. And the next step is to take this dough and we're going to roll it out. I'll show you how. I'm going to take a small amount. I'm going to put it right here on the cutting board. And I'm going to roll it over in the flour that I put down first. And create something that is, maybe 3/4 of an inch across. There we go. Now I've got water here, boiling water with a little salt in it. And I always think it's a good idea before you shape all of these, just to test it, to make sure you're happy with the seasoning and to make sure that they hold together the way that you want them to hold together. So here is one, and I'm going to drop it in the water. And the fact that it goes right to the bottom tells me that it's dense, but my sense is that as it cooks, it will begin to swell, and when it does, it will start to rise up to the top of this pot. Already it's off the bottom. See if I can bring it out to the middle. I don't want it at a big, strong boil, just at the boil. I don't want it to rock around so much that if it's delicate, it's going to break apart. Now, I'm going to move this closer to the center so you can see it, but it has risen up. So it started out dense and heavy and it was on the bottom, and now it's swelling and it's rising up to the top, and that's a good sign. I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to blot it dry, and I want to taste this just to make sure I'm happy with the consistency and I'm happy with the seasoning. Couldn't be happier. So, I roll this. I'll make it just a little bit smaller, and then what you may notice is there's a good deal of flour on the outside, and that will absorb any excess moisture that comes out of the gnocchi as they sit and create a little shell that will hold it together. That flour on the outsides means that what's on the inside can be that much more delicate. Rolling them back and forth like this is really a finesse move, not a power move. So you feel for where it's a little bit thick and keep rolling it. We'll move those back. Once these have been shaped, you could set them in the refrigerator and cook them later. I think that would be entirely appropriate, so don't feel as though you have to start and finish. From this point forward, these can sit very happily in your refrigerator, and actually what you may discover is that they become a little bit easier to handle as the moisture from the interior soaks into the flour on the outside. We're going to cook this pasta. I've got boiling salted water ready. I'm going to have a pan ready to go. And that pan has a little bit of butter, a little knob of butter in it. So we're going to take it right out of the water, toss it with butter, a little salt, pepper, and then I'll put a sprinkling of Parmesan cheese on it, and that'll be it. Okay. So I think just one portion here is all I need. In they go. Maintain a delicate boil, or just below a boil. There we are. Once you know how to make this gnocchi, let's imagine for a second that it's springtime. You make the ricotta gnocchi and you go to the market, and there are the most beautiful baby carrots and fresh asparagus tips, and you toss the gnocchi in butter with carrots and asparagus tips and little Parmesan cheese, and that is a spring expression of this dish. And then you move on into the summer, and the tomatoes are really delicious. And so you make a simple tomato sauce, a little brothy, and when the gnocchi come out of the water, they go right into the tomato sauce. You toss it to coat, a little cheese over the top, and that then goes right onto the plate. Now we move into the fall. In the fall, you might want to take the gnocchi out of the pan and put them into another pan that has a little bit of butter, and you brown that butter with sage leaves. So browned butter and sage. The gnocchi come out, it goes right into that brown butter and sage, and then into the plate, cheese over the top, and it's done. And then in the winter, maybe mushrooms, sauteed mushrooms would be a nice thing. Sauteed mushrooms with parsley and thyme and garlic and a little bit of pecorino cheese over the top, and everything's right with the world. So you can see here, the gnocchi has risen up. I'm going to take it out of the pan and drain it, and we'll put it right into the melted butter. These tend to be a little bit delicate, so just take your time. There we are. So I've coated them with the butter, salt and pepper, and these are ready to go. I'm going to transfer them to a plate. They were hot when they came out of the water, so I don't have to worry about sautéing them for a long time. We'll put this little bit of butter over the top. We'll add the Parmesan cheese that I held onto. So there you have it. Ricotta gnocchi with spinach and pancetta, a little Parmesan cheese and butter over the top. I would say this dish is appropriate any time of the year, but here we've got one for fall, for winter, for the spring, and the height of the summer. When I was first learning how to cook, I was down in New Orleans working at a restaurant down there, and a cook came in and showed me a gumbo that I had never seen before. It was a Lenten gumbo, and rather than use meat, they used greens, all different kinds of field greens. We put in carrot tops, we put in escarole, we put in collards, we put in any number of different things, and he served it up, and it was really delicious. But what really captured my imagination was this: that when you make this soup, in the year to come, you'll make a new friend for every different green that you put into the pot.